Prepare to be transported to a battlefield of intellect and strategy, where a young Magnus Carlsen dared to challenge the mighty Gary Kasparov. This epic clash, reminiscent of the timeless tale of David versus Goliath, defied all expectations. The game starts out with the clocks ticking down, but Kasparov is nowhere to be seen. Kasparov finally appears, but the stakes are extremely high as he's already lost so much time on the clock. He arranges his pieces and the match begins. Magnus starts the match with pawn to d4, and Kasparov matches with a queen's pawn opening. Magnus moves his next pawn to c4, instantly threatening the black pawn. Kasparov responds with pawn to c6, which is more commonly known as the Slav defense, commonly used as a defense to the queen's gambit. As they continue to develop their pieces, Kasparov moves his knight to d7, and the game devolves into a queen's gambit declined. Magnus moves a pawn forward to e3, looking to solidify his defense of the middle four squares, which are commonly seen as the strongest and most important squares on the board. However, Kasparov responds by moving his queen over to a5, which pins the knight on c3. This forces Magnus to defend the pin by moving his other knight over to d2, which puts it in a weaker position as it can no longer impact the center of the board. Kasparov moves his bishop to b4, reinforcing the pin again, and Magnus responds by moving his queen to c2 to defend his knights. Both players castle, and Kasparov decides that it's time to launch his attack. He plays pawn to d4, capturing Magnus's pawn and taking control of the center. However, Magnus responds with knight to b3, giving him a beautiful fork on the queen and pawn, forcing Kasparov to retreat and capturing back control of the center with a pawn of his own. Another trade in the middle of the board allows Magnus to place his bishop in a strong position on c4. Right now, both players are fairly even, with a slight advantage to Magnus, but time on the clock is starting to run low. Kasparov pulls his queen back to c7, and Magnus responds by activating his rook. Kasparov moves his kingside pawn forward to h6, kicking Magnus's bishop on g5. This forces him to retreat the bishop backward, and black responds by moving the bishop over to d6. This leaves Magnus's king in an extremely precarious position and in danger of a check if somehow Kasparov can get his queen over to h2. It will be an instant checkmate and the game will be over for Magnus. Luckily for 13-year-old Magnus, he sees this move and pushes his kingside pawn forward to h3, creating some breathing room. A few moves later, Kasparov plays his bishop to h2, checking Magnus's king. Magnus is forced to move without capturing due to the queen directly threatening the same square. Kasparov moves his knight in front of his queen, allowing Magnus to capture the bishop and trade piece for piece. 13-year-old Magnus Carlsen decides that it's his turn to go on the attack. He moves his queen forward to c5 and moves multiple pieces forward to attack c6. The pawn is looking like it's in big trouble. Magnus captures. They trade pieces back and forth, and Carlsen wins the exchange, coming out a piece ahead. At the same time, he's also threatening to trade his knight for the rook on d8, forcing Kasparov to move it away. At this point in the game, Carlsen has a very active and aggressive position over the current world champion, and things start to get really interesting. Kasparov moves his queen to g6, threatening to check Magnus. He responds by moving his queen to block and offering a queen trade. Kasparov accepts and comes out with a small advantage due to the fact that Magnus now has doubled pawns on the g-file. Kasparov attacks Carlsen's backline, moving his rook to e1 and offering a trade. They are now extremely close to the endgame, and Magnus is going into it with a one-pawn advantage over the world champion. The two continue moving their pieces, handing out checks to each other left and right, both playing extremely accurate moves and not allowing the other any room at all. Carlsen moves his rook to h1, checking Kasparov's king and growing his advantage to almost 2 pawns. Kasparov responds by moving his own rook to b2, threatening to win a pawn, enforcing Carlsen's king back to g3 to defend. A couple of moves later, it seems like a draw is imminent. Both players shake hands and agree on a draw, a truly monumental feat for Magnus Carlsen, proving to himself and the world that even at only 13 years old, he can go toe-to-toe with the reigning world champion, Gary Kasparov.